Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the fanfic panel, and it was organized, I believe, by Miss Jenny Loeb and Miss Ellen Landau. Sorry.
Ellen Landau.
Jenny Loeb. You've already told me I'll pronounce your name, so I don't screw that up too. Ellen Landau.
It's just like window.
Yeah, Lindo. Oh, Ellen Lindo, I love that. And Becky Eisenhuth and myself.
Yay!
Do you want to start with questions, or do you want to say?
I was going to start with a really brief introduction. It's interesting that we've been hearing here all weekend kind of reimaginings of Space 1999 and kind of an attempt to bring it back again. But really, that's what fan fiction has already been doing since the very beginning of when people started writing fan fiction. So I think that's my first comment. And my next comment is I was just going to make a little really brief sort of history of Space 1999 fan fiction for the few of you that may not already know. Just that, you know, Space 1999 was the first science fiction show to have any kind of notoriety or any kind of, you know, more than a couple episodes basically since Star Trek. And when it first came out, a lot of the fans had been fans of Star Trek and some of them segued into Space 1999 fandom. So that's the first thing that came out of, a lot of that came out of there. But also, I don't know how many people were originally present at the creation of Space 1999 fandom and remember how much antagonism there really was directed at Space 1999, the show. I mean, it was basically, there was so much hatred of the show because it wasn't Star Trek. I mean, at that time, space existed, but Star Trek had not yet come back in all its various iterations. I mean, it'd be easy to forget today because back then, the only iteration of Star Trek that had returned was the animated Star Trek TV show, which was geared towards little kids. So there was a lot of antagonism at the beginning, but despite all that antagonism, space fandom, you know, took off and started to flourish. I mean, yes, we are a very tiny little cult fandom, and you can get us all together in one hotel over a weekend or two, and here we all are. But that's kind of the brief thing. But I thought maybe I'd start by asking the members of the panel kind of how they got into Space 1999 fandom, but more specifically, why did they decide to write Space 1999 fan fiction? What was it that made you decide, I have to write some fan fiction? What was it? So maybe we'll start with Rosie.
Hi. Well, I got into Space 1999 because of Barbara Bain and Martin Landau, because I were fans of them from Mission Impossible. And when I saw the show for the first time, Breakaway, I was like blown away. I've always been a science fiction fan, so it was like, oh, this is cool. And some of the stories, you know, you think, oh, that's weak. Or most of it was pretty spot on. But anyway, I just got into writing because I just enjoyed creating a story, and some of the earlier fan fiction I think tended to lean towards romance between Tony and Maya and John and Helena. Don't you agree, ladies?
Definitely.
Yes, and I just felt that there should be deeper stories than just romance, and that's why I started my fan fiction, which of course was a long time ago.
And to interject before I pass the mic to the next person, I don't know if Paul wants it to be known, Paul Benz, or not, but he was one of the co-authors with Rosie, and I think it's interesting that Paul is now a professional writer, and that's a trend that we see in many fandoms, that many people start out as amateur writers, writing for pleasure, strictly for pleasure, and then they decide, hey, I can do this, I like doing this, and they go on to become professionally published authors. So, Yeah, I'll talk. Let's hear from Becky next.
Okay, I wasn't prepared. I didn't think I would be next. Okay, actually, I became a fan of the series, of course, from the inception of it. I absolutely was amazed. I also was a fan of Martin Landau and Barbara Baines, and I grew into the show and started pretty much to love all the characters from day one. And oh, good. And when it came later to the after the show, when I had discovered about fiction and things that other people had written, I thought I could do that. I'm going to give that a try. And so I did. I gave it a shot, and I have to confess, some of that early stuff was really terrible. It's before I kind of found my niche, I guess. And but as a matter of fact, I can go back and look at some of it and just want to tear right through it. But and I think all of us at one point or another probably have felt that way. But basically, for me, it's kind of like what Rosie said. I do love the romance. I like the. But it's not just the romance between characters, but where they're going, where they've been, and how they're going to get to where they're eventually going to get to. And it can include the commander, Dr. Russell. It can include everybody. But it's also the surroundings around them. I did want to make a comment about how I've noticed a very distinct difference between female writers and male writers. And Terry and I had even discussed this. How male writers tend to, just from the fan fiction that I have seen, they love the action aspect of the show, the deep technology and the eagles and things and explosions and things along that lines that surround it, which is wonderful. I mean, there's some really wonderful adventure stories out there and some very technical stories out there. But I do tend to notice that female writers tend to like to get a little deeper into the characters. They tend to write more paragraphs about how a character is feeling opposed to the reaction. So, anyways, that's my take on it, and thank you.
Well, I seem to have inherited the science fiction gene. I remember I grew up in Florida in a little tiny town in the middle of the state, and I remember sneaking a radio to school, a transistor of mine in my lunchbox, and then climbing out on the roof of the school on the Gemini launches, so that, on fruit break, when we were supposed to be drinking our milk and having our fruit while the teachers went to the teachers' lounge and had their cigarette for mid-morning, I would climb out on the roof on launch days and get up there with my transistor and try to watch the launches. Now, it was just a little too far away, but I am like the biggest science geek in the world, and I wanted to fix Space 1999. So, I kept looking at those episodes and going, wait a minute, what if you just tweaked this just a little bit? Now I felt that, and I like the romance aspect too, but I felt that Martin Landau and Barbara Bain did the best job of showing you a devoted couple without doing anything more than picking up a coffee cup, taking a sip, and handing it to the other person. Now that's not something you do with your boss. You just don't share spit with your boss. But you do it with the person you love. And so the romance was already there, you just weren't seeing it. What I wanted to see was like, what happened after they walked down that corridor and turned the corner? Or what were they saying to each other as Victor's standing back there by the eagle with the cigar, toasting them, and John's putting his arm around her just as they turn the corner. So there were things missing that I just had to fill in, and it was like beating its way out of my pen as fast as I could write things down. And the first stuff was just totally horrible. But the way you learn to write is by writing a lot. And you take that crap and you look at it and you say, oh, that's really embarrassing. And you burn it if you need to. And then you pick up the notebook and you write something else. And I got better at it while I was writing and rewriting. And then the internet came along, and I think that was like the totally coolest thing, because suddenly you could share it without the expense of paper and mimeographs, and you could edit it without typing it and typing it and typing it. So it became easier not only to write, but to share it. And I've just enjoyed doing that ever since.
Yeah, I think the do-it-yourself nature of fandom and fan fiction is pretty evident. You know, it's like, if it's not there, I'm gonna make it appear. You know, if there's not a story about like a character that was on the show and I want to know more about that character, well, who's gonna do it? I guess I'll have to do it. I'll pick up my pen or now my computer and I'll just write that story about that little crewman that's only seen in, you know, one scene in one episode. And I think actually that was one of the great things that Ellen did in her Energized series. There were a lot of like the crewmen that were kind of the minor crewmen that you tried to flesh out. I don't know if that was like consciously, if you started assigning the writers that were writing in that, you know, universe and saying, you know, hey, somebody should try to do something to make Yasko actually seem like an interesting person. And I thought, I forget who it was that did that, but somebody actually did that. And I thought, wow, that was a really interesting story. And I actually think Yasko is an interesting character after reading that. Whereas if you just watch the TV show, I don't think you're really going to think Yasko is all that interesting a character. So, yeah, that was one of them. And also that you did that whole Unsung Alphen series in one of the fanzines where you sort of invented people and kind of said, what would these people be thinking and how would they react with the other crew that's the actual, the name crew, with the commander or the doctor or whoever, and that was interesting. I think another part of fan fiction that's interesting is just kind of the desire to kind of play around with the characters, and then sometimes, you know, some things just kind of come out of maybe the interaction between the writers. And I think the one thing that's interesting in the fandom and in the fan fiction writing community is you are building community and you're making friends with people and you start being influenced as a writer by the people you're writing either with or maybe for. Sometimes I know people say, okay, you know, somebody's birthday's coming up, I'll write them a story that I think maybe they would like as a present, or maybe I'm like, hey, how outrageous do I have to be to make somebody laugh? And somebody's like, wow, you were pretty outrageous there, but it did make me laugh.
That was my 25th anniversary present from my husband.
All right.
Was a story he wrote called Shooting Star. He wrote me a story for our anniversary, and then he bought me a star as well to go with it. So you get a whole theme thing. Yeah, it is a lot of fun to collaborate on things. I absolutely love to have a bunch of people play in the sandbox because they come up with amazing ideas that I wouldn't have thought of. Now, you know, with my background, and you should write what you know because you always sound like an idiot if you don't. You know, with my background, I'm always trying to put a few animals on Moonbase Alpha. They really need something. They need some food. They need some chickens. They need some fish. They need something. But, you know, when we started writing the Energized universe, and I invited other people to submit stories based on the framework that I'd laid out, someone wrote a constitution. And it turned out he's an attorney. And and then he decided, well, you know, 10 years down the road, they're going to be kind of concerned about some of the things in here. So I've written a second constitution. I would never have tried to write a constitution for him. I personally would probably have gone with some kind of, you know, rational anarchy because I've been a Heinlein fan for many, many years and always thought that was a great idea. But yeah, suddenly we had a constitution because someone else thought it was a great idea. And we were just talking about a group of us got together in Biloxi pre-Katrina, and we sat down at a restaurant and we were talking about the characters. And by the end of the meal, we were going, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell the same story from different characters' point of view. You take John. Did you have John or Helena?
I think I had Helena.
I think you had Helena.
Actually, I think I did them both.
No, wait a minute. I think you had John and Michael had Helena.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. But we all had a different character reacting to what the situation was. And we'd agreed on the situation and we scattered. And within 24 hours, we had a story written where you went from one point of view to the next and the action just followed the characters all over Moonbase Alpha. And it's the look. The look.
And it was based on second season when the rescue ship arrives.
Yes.
With Tony's brother.
Yes.
And actually we did it kind of round robin because we wrote the first section and then we bounced off that, and so it was like 3 or 4 different rounds.
Yes.
Until we got it completed.
Mm-hmm. That one
within the 24
that one lives in the Florida universe, which if you don't know is kind of my outrageous universe, and I do all the things that you really shouldn't do.
But it was such fun.
It is. It's just such a fun, trashy little universe, and we've done all sorts of things like we sat around with a bunch of Coronas on a dock one day and decided, no one's ever really effectively brought the moon back. By golly, I'm bringing the moon back. So we went out and we got it. And we brought it back. That one's pretty racy too. That one is an NC-17 sort of universe, which is kind of fun to have around.
You gave Helena a twin sister too, didn't you?
And yes, that was our friend Sharita who Sharita emailed me one day and said, I just created a new character. She's going to be Helena's twin sister, and I'm naming her Ellen. And I'm like, oh no, you're not. I said, you find another name for her. So yeah, Helena's twin sister is kind of the black sheep of the family, but she has a good heart, and she keeps everyone on their toes. And she's in the look. I believe I wrote that one because I usually end up with Melissa's point of view at one time. I like Melissa's point of view. She's a hedonist. So.
I think we were going to hold the questions till we're maybe about 15 minutes from the end. Can you tell us when we're closer to that?
Yeah. Anybody know what time it is? Sarah, be the time check.
Okay, what time do we start? 4?
4.
Okay.
We have to stop at 4:30.
Okay. With my grandson, we always use a timer. So my 5-year-old grandson will do anything with a timer. So we're just going to give us a 15-minute timer, and then it'll quack, and we'll just stop right there.
So you're going until 4:30?
Yes.
Yeah, so-
We have to do the wall. We have to have closing ceremonies, and then finish the wall. And be out of here hopefully by 6.
Well, we'll talk a couple more minutes and we'll take questions. Okay, my next question is kind of to ask people, who do you think were the authors that influenced you, either science fiction authors or general authors that influenced your approach to writing, your style of writing, maybe even influenced a choice of story? No?
I don't know that I can answer that. Ray Bradbury was probably my number one. As for my style, I don't know. I just kind of tried to do what I wanted to do, I guess.
You
Yeah.
kind of develop your own style coming out from who you are.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
You find what a way that you're
Yeah, comfort zone. Yeah, because when Paul and I were writing together, like you said, 2 brains and 1 book, and he had to do a lot of explaining of why we had to call the 3rd one Blutzeugger. But never mind. It worked out. So, yeah, I just did my own thing. I don't think I let anybody influence me. Just followed my gut.
Becky?
Anybody can tell you, if you ever seen it, particularly any of my earlier stories, they were always kind of dark, and I kind of like to have like a supernatural feel to them. And so I will say probably like a Stephen King or something like that kind of influenced a lot of mine. I kind of like to put it, these days I kind of like a combination of Stephen King and Joanna Lindsay for the romance. So, you know, the real weird kind of combination of romance and scary. But I have to admit, I do like Ray Bradbury as well. So when it comes to the science angles and that might quite very well have been an influence too.
I rode an elevator with Ray Bradbury one time. That was the coolest thing. Michael and I got off the elevator and nearly fainted. We were like, oh my God, you've been on the elevator with Ray Bradbury. You must look like total geeks, but Heinlein was like a god to me. And I just loved the way he writes and the way he experimented with things. And a hard science background too. I really want my science to work. One of the happiest days of my life was seeing the Scientific American article with the cover about alternate universes, there being an infinity of alternate universes out there. Infinity is a big number. And it allows us to have everything. I can have a gazillion different universes of just Space 1999. And Heinlein did that sort of thing too. So probably he was the most. The other would probably be Anne McCaffrey, who has managed to create such an amazing world, and world building is just the most fun. And her world has a definite timeline, and things happen over huge spans of time, and I like that. You can plop down anywhere and find a story.
You know, I got to say this because I've been thinking about it for quite some time. Terry Bowers, you wrote a story a long time ago, and it has stayed with me for years. It was a wonderful story about how the generations, they found their planet. Generations later, their descendants were telling the story of Moonbase Alpha and the things that happened on it. And it has always stayed with me because it was wonderful. It was them like around a campfire telling these stories, and they were not quite right. You know how things get started and people's stories are told. It's like you can take an episode and they told it the way they thought it should have been around the campfire, and there were things that were kind of wrong. You see the episode, you knew it was wrong, the things that they were talking about. But I just thought that was such an incredibly clever story, Terry, and I just always wanted to tell you that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I just want to make maybe one more comment before we do open the panel up for questions. Just that I think that, you know, we've seen a lot of the guys in Space 1999, a lot of the guys like the ships, they like the toys, they like to build their models. And I think the women like to write fanfic. They want to explore the relationships between the characters. And so I hope that whoever makes this reimagining of Space 1999 doesn't just focus on the models and the special effects, but also pays a little bit of attention to the characters and their interactions.
If not, I volunteer to write those behind-the-scenes stories.
Well, there you go. Maybe there's more fanfic coming when it disappoints you or doesn't live up to your expectations. It's probably already got fanfic coming. So on that note, let's open up to questions from the audience. Anybody have any burning questions they want to ask?
Did you have a question? Well, I just wanted to follow up on Rose's comment about hostility towards... Okay,
right.
Was that your comment? Or
That was me mentioning that was quite evident. I mean, I went to a Unicon, and that was there.
You were the one that said that.
Yeah, I was the
so
one.
I just wanted to say that at the time that Space 99 was coming out, there was an enormous amount of hostility, and I had just gotten involved with Trek fandom. I was going to Star Trek conventions, and because the show was marketed to the Trekkies as, you know, this is what you're going to love now.
Right, that's very
It was
true.
really the way it was marketed.
Right.
And why they hated it. And in fact, when I published the first issue of Cosmo Connection in 1976, I'm just reading my my editorial where I basically said, you know, if you think you hate it, well, you know, let's read these stories first and watch the show.
Right.
And actually, somebody had actually written a commentary about Space 1999. She was a Trekkie, and how much she hated it, and how bad it was, and the mysterious unknown force and all that. And so I reprinted her comment, and I said, well, wait a minute, also read the Space 99 stories and watch the show, and so, you know, you have a balanced thing, but give it a chance.
Right.
And so I had to sort of, you know, I was worried that people would read this first issue and say, no, we don't care about Space 1999. Don't muck up your fanzine with that. Focus on Star Trek. So I was just trying to combine the two so that we could sort of bring those two communities together. But I really think that if it had been marketed differently, they wouldn't say, you know, Trekkies, you don't have to love Star Trek anymore. You can love our show.
Right.
There wouldn't have been this polarization.
Well, I think the other thing was, like I was saying, Space 1999 was the first big sci-fi show to come after Star Trek. And then, you know, after Space, then we got Star Wars. I think Star Wars is kind of what changed everything and made sci-fi media fans kind of more willing to say, okay, I don't have to just like one thing. I can like a lot of things. I think if you polled most of the people in this room, they're not going to tell you that they only like Space 1999. I think they're going to tell you that they'll also go to a Star Wars movie. They'll also watch episodes of Stargate or Serenity or, you know, whatever the current TV or other TV shows are. And so I think that was...
They killed off Wash.
But they...
Obviously, I've got to write an alternate ending for...
Well, that's... Yeah, how many... I mean, here's another question I was going to ask the panel. And I kind of know some of the answer to this, but, you know, what other TV shows have you written for? Are you a monogamist? Have you only written for Space 1999? Or are you spreading the wealth around? You're a bigamist or maybe polyamorous? I don't know. Let's hear from the panel.
Okay, the only other fandom I've written for is Beauty and the Beast, the TV series with Linda Hamilton and Ron Perlman.
I think Becky's written for a number, haven't you? Haven't you, Becky, written for quite a number of different fandoms?
Yeah, a little here and there. Probably the last one I wrote for within memory is a little TV series. It was called The Lost World. And Rachel Blakely, Will Stowe, that was that group. And the reason I can even mention it is that actually Nick Tate was on it. He played Jack the Ripper in one episode. And it was very good. It was like a combination. Anyways, the point being, yeah, I have written for that show. And yeah, I have written for a few of them, but nothing that I can think of right now. That was the last one I can actually recall.
I've got an infinity of universes to come up with for Space 1999. Why would you know, it's just one of those perfect storms. And I tend to interpret the rest of my environment through a focus lens, which, wow, that really sounds awful, of, you know, it gives you a chance to focus down on what the real problem is, whether it's, you know, whether it's an illness or a relationship problem or a work problem. You've got a population of 300 people that can't get off the boat. So that really focuses down on what the issue is. And a lot of times I find, you know, whatever's going on in my real life, I tend to try to interpret the way I would have to interpret it if I lived on Moon Base Alpha. So I'm sticking with Alpha.
So you're saying you get a lot of your inspiration just from real life events, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so does anybody have any other questions? Yes?
Okay, it's pretty much for whoever, but you've written for more newsletter stories, right? If I'm correct, you didn't get into the Energized universe or the Florida universe, right?
Oh, Rosie's mostly written for written fanzines, right? Yeah, I think she means whether you've written for online. Do you mean whether online or written fanzines?
No,
Okay.
No, that's not where I'm going.
Okay.
I found you guys online reading the stuff through the Space 1999 links and fan fiction. I know about Ellen, I know about Becky. They have their own little groupings of stories. And Rosie, from what I've only seen, they've posted like PDF files of earlier newsletters. What I'm going to ask though is, are you guys pretty much written out right now, or do you still have things that are going to come out later? Because I know it's a big gap of time that you started these stories, but they're not added to, but you did add one, I think it was last year, to your, was it your Florida University or Energized?
I think actually Ellen updated relatively recently, updated a couple stories, so maybe check
Maybe I
back.
missed it then.
There's two new stories by a veteran who has been writing in the style of Burned, and he's combining, and it's not Burned, but if you've seen the show, he writes with the same voice as the guy who does Burned, and they're definitely energized stories, and they're going to merge into the energized universe. I have other stories out there, but I also have a 2-month-old and a 5-year-old grandson living with me at the time, and so there's no time for writing right now.
But you've written over a period of time already too, so I'm just wondering,
Right.
are you written out or
No.
do you have more to come?
There's a list of stories.
You have a new fanzine out right now, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. There's a small Florida Universe story in this. It is not an NC-17 one, guys. Sorry, it's a G-rated one. There's a story I've written with my husband Michael, mainly because I wrote it, and then I said it's not finished, but I don't know what to do with it, and so Michael finished it. Michael's got an awesome one in here. I mean, who else could put a tiger on Moonbase Alpha? It's really good. Becky's got a story in here. Terry's got a couple of stories in here. Charlene has a story in here. David, wave David. David's got a story in here. And if you haven't read David's fan fiction, it's out there too on space1999.net at Metaforms, and his is awesome. Very detailed into the workings of Moonbase Alpha, and I love going in there and see how he thinks that the moon base works. And it's really neat, and his linguistic stuff is just awesome. I just love that. Bob Wood has a story in here too, but this is available right now for $20 for the paper copy, and then with the paper copy, because I'm an e-reader person, there is also a link to the e-version of the same book, and the proceeds of this will go toward the convention and the convention charity. So anyone who wants to purchase one of those, we have some available. Yeah, Becky.
Yeah, my zine, if you've seen it, it's also, by the way, all the money from the zine is going to this convention, to the charity, and offset cost. And yeah, that's it right there. And just also to let you know, I've had several people come to me and ask me if I would be willing to actually do voice recordings of my zines, which just absolutely fascinated me. I had never considered that before. So in the future, you never know, I might actually you may actually have me reading it to you. So, you know, if anybody's interested in something like that, you know, by all means, let me know, okay? Thanks.
I guess, I think we're wrapping up, but if it's a quick question, maybe we can...
Real quick, just for Rosie. Yeah. Are you planning any stories, any fanzines here in the near future? We'd love to see more work from you.
Okay, well, is this working?
Here, try this one.
I really haven't had a lot of time lately with a lot of personal stuff that's been going on in my life. Yeah, I probably will. Yeah.
Cool.
I just have to have enough time to sit down, and hopefully things are going to start settling down for me, because it's been a rough year. So, yeah, we'll let you know.
Yay.
And just one more thing, I have to say, on my behalf, this convention has been a real inspiration. And if you're a fan fiction writer, you see something like this, you're here, you get re-energized, and I have to admit, it makes me want to write. So, thank you all very much.